You're listening to Coding Blocks, episode 36. Subscribe to us and leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app.
Visit us at codingblocks.net where you can find show notes, examples, discussion, and more.
And send your feedback, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net. Follow us on Twitter at codingblocks, or head to www.codingblocks.net and find all our social links there at the top of the page. With that, welcome. I'm Alan Underwood.
I'm Joe Zach.
And I'm Michael Outlaw.
And start us off with a little bit of news. We have a winner for our t-shirt giveaway.
Winner, winner, chicken dinner.
Yes, so Wade is the big winner. We have a little video of the honest pick in the the raffle.
Check out our Vine.
That's right. So we'll have a link for that up there.
Also,
Also,
that's our second Vine.
the what?
That's our second Vine, so make sure you subscribe because we are killing it.
Yes, we are.
Right. 2 in a year.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Hey, but they were important because they're always for a contest.
They are always giveaways.
You know,
so
we're
that's-
100% on our contest usage of our Vine account. So
yeah, that's good stats. In other news, we got several reviews, a couple from the UK, which is pretty excellent.
you guys rock.
Yes, you guys are amazing. So we got one from Aruthastra, Lou S. on Stitcher, Seb S. Willowwood, The Dark Knight 15, and Free Apps Hunter. So guys, thank you so very much for taking the time to go over to either Stitcher or iTunes and leave us a review.
I mean, when Batman takes the time out of his
That's
busy
amazing,
day
right?
to leave you a review.
Yeah, he's the 15th one.
You know that, yeah, well, because the other 14 Batmans were busy. You know, the Joker is, taking their time.
Right. But yeah, we really do appreciate them. I mean, it's bigger than what you guys could imagine. So thank you for taking your time to do that. And this isn't really news, but I thought I'd ask a question because this is just kind of random. If you work with, especially web apps, I'm sure that this is the case with other things, but if you're working with web apps, a lot of times you'll find that you're using a particular framework, right, on the front end, be it Angular or Knockout or EXTJS or something like that, right? And one of the things that I always struggle with, and you always make the decision you need to get the job done initially, and then you circle back and you go crazy. But let's say that your front end or your UI tier, it requires data in a certain way, and it has to be formatted for that particular framework, right? How do you go about handling that on your middleware? Like if you're writing the server side calls, do you write your stuff so, like, let's say that you have data coming out and they're data tables typically, but this stuff has to be massaged into a format that front end framework can use. Do you write your middle tier so that it returns your data table and then you wrap it with something else, or like, how do you go about doing that?
I feel like is this the same question that I think you asked the other day? Like, well, off mic, obviously, where you were talking about like which one do you write first, your back end, or like how do you mock the data that you want for it if it's for a front end piece?
I ask that? I don't think that was me.
I feel like you did.
I don't
Like
think
an example, if I understand correctly, might be like a date. Like if you want a specific date format, do you return it as a string from the server, or do you format that? Now date's probably a bad example.
Yeah, that's kind of a
you're
weak
probably
example.
talking about more.
What if it was like a grid of data?
Yeah, like for instance, some components require that you wrap like a piece of metadata and give it a row count, a page count, what your start number is. But it's very specific to that framework or that component. Let's say that you're using some sort of component that you bought and it requires that you give this metadata back in a certain way. And obviously, if you went and used another grid component somewhere, it would want data in a slightly different way. So if you decided at some point in time that you needed to rip that old component out and put a new one in, depending on how you wrote your middle tier stuff that actually goes and talks to the database or whatever, you might have a lot of rewriting to do, as opposed to if you had just wrapped it somehow. It was just one of those things that came up that I was like,
so I don't think you're going to like my answer.
I'm curious. I don't think I'll dislike it. I think I'm just curious as to what you guys would say.
Well, I'm going to say it depends because
I don't like your answer.
Yeah, see, I told you. Because let's say on the one hand, if you're talking about the UI has already been well defined, like it's already been designed, what the end state of it should look like, then I might, depending on the circumstances, start all the way at the database layer and then start building up from there, like making the queries work and perform optimally and return what I want and what I'm going to need, and then start building from there, right? But if it's the case where I'm kind of exploring, like, what do I want this thing to even look like, right? Well, I don't know what data I need. So how can I start with the data? I got to start trying to decide what I want this thing to look like. And in that case, then it's all going to be like hard-coded, just fake data, just to like get the presentation in place to see, like, is that what I want it to look like?
But once you figured that out, though, at that point, do you layer it? Like do you say, okay, the data table is obviously the data that I need, but then all this additional metadata, how are you going to
What was the additional metadata again?
So like let's say that you said a grid, right? Like this grid needs particular things like a row count, a page number. I'm trying to like the
that's
sorting.
That's going to be like those are going to be the trivial kind of things that you're probably already doing elsewhere.
No,
right?
not necessarily, because like in the case of a grid component or something, like there could be all types of things, right? Like what's the sorted column? What's like there could be several pieces of metadata.
What I mean though is that like chances are probably pretty good that you're doing similar grids elsewhere in an app, and that same kind of metadata, you've already solved that problem elsewhere too. So the real challenge of this particular element is trying to decide A, what does it look like, and B, what shape does the data come back in, right? And so those are the two things, and that's why I'm saying, like, depending on the circumstance, I'm going to start from one of those two opposite ends of the spectrum and then work.
Okay, so let me put it into a more...
I don't know where Joe fits into this.
Let me put it into a more concrete example, and then I'll get Joe's take as well. Let's say that, okay, you know that typically, let's take a web API call for C#, for instance, right? That's your endpoint that you're calling. And typically you get data out, and that might just be a data table, right? Fairly simple. You called the database, you got some data, and it gets returned basically, in a data table format. All right, now you have this specific requirement for this component that's going to be using that data. You wouldn't want to go into your web API tier and necessarily wrap it there, because anything else that needs to consume that particular piece of data doesn't necessarily want all that extra chunk of metadata that doesn't work for another component. And that's what I'm getting at. How do you separate that stuff out? So I'm curious, Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually had a similar situation recently. I was working with some charting stuff, and you could write a data provider for it, and you would have a column named key and a column named value. And so I was kind of tempted to name the return from the server key and value, because I could just kind of pop this thing right in there. But that's not descriptive. It's not consistent with the rest of the code base, so I ended up transforming it. But I think that's kind of an example of the kind of stuff you're talking about, where you've got a specific format you need to meet in order to get this component to work. And so where do you do that kind of rearrangement? Say you've got a hash table, but it needs to be an array or something like that. And, I think my vote is to do it on the client, but I'd be lying if I said that I never cheated.
It's kind of interesting. So, like, what you're saying is true. Now, in the case of what you're talking about, maybe that's something easy enough that when it gets retrieved from the server, it's easy enough to massage on the client, right? Like, you could write some sort of provider that would automatically translate that. But in the case of something to where it actually needs additional metadata, right? Like, for instance, you have some sort of search that searches through 1 million records in your database, right? And this grid expects you to tell it, okay, well, we know this is paging, and you're on page 10. You need to know that, so that's going to come back in the metadata. You need to know exactly how many rows there were, because you need to display, hey, you're displaying rows 50 through 60 of, 1 million. So there's all this metadata that comes back. So now the question is, okay, you don't necessarily want to put that into that particular web API call unless you're going to make sure that everybody knows that, hey, every one of these endpoints, these web API endpoints here, are made specifically for this particular grid component, right? So then that brings up, okay, well, how do you do that? Do you funnel this through something else so that you have like a proxy endpoint that you call that then calls some other method to go get it and then wrap it? Maybe there's a parameter that you pass in that says, hey, make this component. And that's the thing that's always that kind of bounces around. And I mean, we've been doing this stuff a while, but these are things that you run into all the time to where it's like, okay, I know we're using this component today, But in a year from now, when they say, hey, we want to switch to the, component XYZ over here because it is so much better, if you wrote all your server-side code to do things specifically for that old one, you now have a lot more work to go back and redo. So
Yep.
it was just one of those things that kind of came up, and I was like, I'm curious what these guys' take would be on this.
You know what, though? If you keep it consistent, like let's say you had an interface that you implemented in some sort of factory that would create it and associate that metadata, then you would have a nice way of finding everywhere that you needed to change, assuming that you were kind of swapping out all of the grids. So it's a nice use of the kind of tools if you're working in a language that has that kind of support.
Well, that's a good point. Like if you made it a factory, even if you didn't switch out every single thing, right? It could just be another instance in that factory that it creates, right? Like,
Yep.
Here's the old school component. It'll create that one for you, and here's the new component. That's a nice take on it. It's interesting.
Hey, so changes topic here. I totally didn't even think to mention this before, but this is the season. I don't even know if you realize which season this is. Like
Christmas?
that's what everyone would say, and you're wrong. It's Star Wars, man.
Oh,
How did you not know that? So my youngest asked me this question, and I thought, like, wow, this is so relevant. Like, what is a software developer's favorite Star Wars character?
Huh.
No one?
I'm kind of worried if someone says Han is the answer, even though it might be my answer.
No, it is Jabba the Hutt.
Oh, nice. I was thinking, Han shoots first, asks questions later. He's kind of moody.
Java the Hutt. He gets strangled, right?
You know what?
That's true.
You're trying to like overthink this thing, man.
No. Java's dying.
Yeah, we'll be sure to let Oracle know.
Yeah.
Your
I'll be
purchase of
surprised.
Sun was a total waste of money.
Right. But yeah, so that I don't know. I thought that would be fairly relevant for everybody, because it's one of those things that comes up, and a lot of times it's just get it done as fast as you can, right? Because you have some deadline that you have to meet.
Wow, I thought you were about to say get her done.
I could totally do that.
That's all we need.
But
Well, speaking of questions, if you guys have any questions, you can hit us up at comments@codingblocks.net. Well, let us know if you want us to keep it private, though, because otherwise it's kind of weird. Sometimes we don't necessarily know if you want us to discuss your question on the air. So,
yeah,
throw it out there either way.
yep. And Joe has some news here.
Yeah, I mentioned one of the episodes we were talking about I forget what the word is now, but basically keeping your posture straight, all that sort of stuff, ergonomic. I was having some issues with the hands, and I ended up having wrist surgery, actually, carpal tunnel release. So thought you guys might be interested in it. It's kind of an occupational hazard. At least it's common for people in our industry. So, just thought I'd kind of throw it out there. I actually had it done right around the same time that Brooke Shields had both of hers done.
Oh,
So I'm like sitting in doctor appointments offices, like watching her on TV, and she's got like this crazy cast where she got both her hands done.
So you're
And
just
it's
like
in a
Brooke
big
Shields.
X. Yeah. I have a newfound respect for her.
Yeah, exactly.
And
like
I
it.
don't know how she's wrong, because let me tell you, they told me that I would be back to work like that, that weekend if I wanted to, and that was BS. It hurts. I'm still having a hard time like grabbing like door handles and stuff. But,
Oh, really?
I have been able to work. Yep.
you had this done, what, like 2 weeks ago, right? No, 3 maybe.
Almost a month now, 3 weeks.
Man. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's-
I guess I have Star Wars on the brain because obviously when he said that he had surgery, I was like, dude, did you get like a bionic arm like Luke?
That's right.
Really?
Well, yeah, his surgery looked a lot easier than mine, although there was no Bacta tank involved, which is nice.
Although the irony is Outlaw's not going to see this movie for like another month.
Nah,
so-
man, I'll see it like in February.
Yeah, so he's all excited
Yeah.
about it, but by that time, everybody
Well, I'm
else-
excited because it's that much closer to February.
Yeah, fair enough.
You gotta let the crowds die down, man.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But I will say I haven't had any numbness or anything, and now that I can use my mouse again, I'm back to playing video games again. It's not so bad. So if you have any questions or you want to talk about it, I am very interested in that subject.
I am curious though. Did you change up anything? Did you change a keyboard? I know that you got the vertical mouse. Is there anything else you changed?
Yeah, the vertical mouse, everything else seems tiny now, so I'm totally sticking with that. I have been looking at keyboards still. Like, I just can't decide between a sculpt or a split. Though, the worst thing that came out of this actually was like I couldn't really play intense clicking or even like console games because my hand just hurt. So I started playing Warcraft again, which so I'm back on the crack because I just didn't have to click that much for certain things. So now I'm in trouble.
So-
and all my friends are gone. So if you guys still play and are on the server, you should let me know so I can join you.
So you didn't go for the SwiftPoint GT wireless ergonomic mobile mouse?
No, is that the one that was like the size of a quarter?
It was the one. Yeah, it was the really small one that was like the pen or pencil grip.
By the way, after we mentioned that, I went back and watched some videos on it. It's actually a really cool mouse.
Well, oh yeah, by the way, after we had mentioned that and I was putting the show notes together for that episode, which if you haven't already heard, that was episode 34 where we talked about it. But then, because like one of the cool things that they mentioned about this was like, oh, it's the same, this mouse fits your hand in the same position that a pen or pencil would. And I'm like, and at first I was like, oh yeah, when we were doing the recording, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And then I remembered, oh wait, writing sucks.
It does.
Like
Your hand always cramp up.
Totally. Like I can't write my name more than once without it hurting. I'm so
Good
used to
point.
a keyboard now. So I was like, why would I want my mouse to be like that?
That's an
That's a
excellent
horrible
point.
idea.
Yeah, I wrote a check the other day and it was horrible just doing that. I was like, ugh,
You
I
wrote
got to
a
write out
check.
the dollar amount in words. And I couldn't remember. I actually had to ask my wife, I'm like, I signed it on the front. I feel like I should sign it on the back, but I can't remember.
Was it like, carved in stone or something? Like why?
These doctor's
crazy.
offices, man, they are ancient and they're all their websites are terrible. It makes me feel really sketched out about going to these guys.
It's amazing though. Like you would have been one of those guys on The Price is Right, like doing the check thing, and
Yeah.
they're like, "You totally wrote that wrong."
Yeah.
So you get called out in front of 1,000 people in the audience.
Yeah,
Man.
I totally did had to tear one up as I wrote the wrong year on it. I'm just like, oh, this sucks.
Man, I can't imagine right now. I get upset if I go to a place and it even looks like they have some form of tap to pay and I can't tap to pay. I'm like, what? Why do you have that device there? Like,
You teasing me?
I mean, I break down mentally inside. I don't like actually say anything.
First world problems. That's what we
Yeah.
have here.
Pretty much.
All right. What we got next?
Okay, so I might have made a mistake or two. So I don't even remember. I think it was episode 35, maybe. That like we were talking about. Actually, it was probably episode 34, and we were talking about SSDs and that new mSATA 2. I think it is.
NVMe.
Yeah, that Samsung put out.
Yeah.
And I made a comment about like using that in a MacBook Air, but then I was like, oh man, I'm a moron. That the MacBook Airs don't use mSATA. They use like a variant of PCI Express that looks similar to, I don't even know the specifics. It looks similar to mSATA, but it's actually like a variant of mini PCI Express or some crap like that. And I was like, oh yeah, that one gets me every time. I forget about that. But then also in like the, change log, if we could go back and like correct things, I thought about something too. And, not to call you out, Joe, but
But he's gonna do it.
yeah, here we go. Prepare yourself. So in episode 35, last episode, we talked about, you'd had this tip of the week where you were talking about flipping the X and the Y when
Oh, yeah.
processing an array. And at first, like when we were recording it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then like when it came time to put the show notes together, I was like, hold on, I'm scratching my head and I'm like, hey, that doesn't make sense. How would that prove anything? Because then I was thinking about like, okay, the whole premise was if you had a 2-dimensional array, and Joe was supposing that if you were to, let's say that how do you one of them is an X and one of them is a Y, whichever one you want to choose. Like let's say for each X element there's it represents an array, and you're going to address that as Y's, right? Does that
Right.
make sense?
All right.
Okay. So then what Joe was saying was that, like, as you're processing that, if you were to flip that, and instead of doing a for loop on and iterate through all of your X's, and then inside of that do a for loop and iterate over all your Ys, then instead reverse that and do your Ys first and then your X's, and that would be faster. And at first, like, I was like, okay, I think I see that. And then it didn't make any sense as I was putting the show notes together. And because, like, what I really stumbled on was I was like, wait a minute, how can this be like any kind of performance gain? Like, and even in the conversation, like Joe mentioned like a micro performance. I forget exactly how he worded it, but I was like, man, current RAM speeds, like, there's no way that can make a difference, right? Like, even if you're reading straight off of disk, like, unless you're reading off some really slow disk, then maybe, but, you know, and then it had to be like a large data structure that you're worried about. But I was like, what's a scenario where this really would matter? And so it took me a while and I had to research this, but what it was really in reference to that we didn't mention in the show was when it's a coordinate system like your display. So if you were processing an image on screen, that's where it would matter.
Yeah, you want to do these things sequentially. Right?
So rather than going, so if in that case, if every X represented a row on your screen and every Y represented a column, what you don't want to do is go row by row down from the top left of your screen to the bottom of your screen and then start back up at the top and then work your way down. Instead, you want to go from the top left to the top right and then come back and go left to right, left to right. Think about the 90s when you would download an image.
Refresh.
Right? When you would download, when you were like looking at anything online in the 90s, right? Like it came in real slow like that. That kind of coordinate system, like if you think about his tip in that regard, then it makes sense.
So it wasn't complete rubbish.
No, it wasn't at all. It's just that I don't feel like we described it well in that example.
That was my worst tip ever.
No, I didn't think it was. I didn't think it was a bad tip. But it was just, and even on Alan's, there was another comment too. Oh man, who was it that commented? Somebody commented on it in the.
Oh, on Twitter. Yeah. Why wouldn't you just do a for loop? Yeah.
Yeah, because in that same episode you had mentioned using a for each loop, and if you wanted to iterate over your you're in a for each loop and you're iterating over some collection, but you need to modify that collection, then instead you might do something dirty by having like another collection that represents either the end state or the deltas that you want to, you know, add or remove or something like that. And that after you break out of your for each loop that you would then do the collection modification.
Yep.
And I don't remember. I'd like to give credit.
I could probably find it, but yeah, it was on Twitter.
You know, one of the listeners commented in and said, well, if you just used a for loop instead of a for each loop, then you don't have that exception problem. Because specifically the exception is collection was modified, enumeration operation may not execute. But using a for loop, you could do all of that collection manipulation.
It was Mike DePaul.
Thank you.
Yep. So yeah, that was excellent, and it's absolutely true. If you do a for loop, then there's no enumeration that you're stepping through. There's no next and all that kind of thing. So because you're just referencing things by index at that point, and it doesn't care.
Right. So I felt like those were, you know, big enough like oops that, you know, should probably be mentioned.
Yep, they were good.
And you know what? We should mention we got some really great comments, and we're not going to talk about any or all of them, but we even got a poem on the episode 34. So if you guys ever are bored on the internet, you should go to our website and check out the show notes and read some of the comments because they're very entertaining.
Yes. All right. So
let's do this.
Yeah, now it's time to get into it.
The 12-factor app. Dun dun dun. Part 4.
Yes.
So today we're going to be talking about the last 3 chapters of the 12-factor app. Dev prod parity, logs, and admin processes. So let's start with dev prod parity. Who wants to intro us into dev prod parity?
Sure, I can do that. So basically the idea here is to keep development, staging, and production as similar as possible. And when they say similar, this was I thought was particularly interesting, is they didn't necessarily mean like line by line or like necessarily the kind of backend systems you're dealing with. They actually mentioned 3 gaps specifically, and we're going to talk about those right now. The ones they mentioned first was the tools. So that's things like, if your production website is using SQL Server, you should be using SQL Server locally. That's kind of the common use case that you think of when you think about dev prod parity. But the second case they mentioned was actually time. And that's in reference to there being sometimes in some environments large gaps between releases. And so the code that's out in production that you might be doing support on could be months behind the code that you're kind of doing your day-to-day work on. And that's an example of dev and prod being different. And the third example they gave was actually personnel, which is cases where sometimes the people deploying the application aren't the people writing it. So there's kind of a disconnect between the people who kind of push it up there, do some clicking around and verifying if stuff is working like they expect, and how they might see that differently than the people who actually built the system.
So I wanted to break this apart and talk about maybe backwards from how they had it and start with the tools, right? Because I found it kind of contradictory to some of it felt like it was a little bit contradictory to some of the previous chapters where like all of a sudden now as we're approaching the end and it's saying, oh yeah, remember how we talked about how you could abstract everything away before? Yep. Well, we want you using the exact same thing as what's in production now.
Yeah, it's abstract it so you can do this stuff however you want to and be really flexible, but don't actually use that flexibility.
Which I can't argue with though, because honestly, like every opportunity I've ever had, I want the same environment. I want my environment that I'm developing on to match as closely as possible to what it's actually going to run on. But it just felt like some of the other chapters where it's like, wait a minute, didn't we talk about having everything as a backing service that you could easily swap out? And like, why does it matter? And now all of a sudden it's like, yeah, but make sure it's the exact same backing service.
Yeah, yep. I will say, like, I try and follow at least this part. Like, if being that we do a lot of .NET stuff, like, I'll even try and run the full-blown IIS, right, locally as opposed to just the development server. Or SQL Server, I mean, they've done a good job providing developers with their enterprise-level SQL Server. So you basically run a full-blown enterprise database on your environment. And that is a way to almost guarantee that when something goes from point A to point B, it's going to be the same.
Well, when it comes to IIS, I'm with you on that, but that's more of laziness on my part. And that's because as much as I would like to use IIS Express, or might like to use IIS Express, because, in theory it is kind of nice, but, a nice concept, but the having to run, hit F5 when I might not even want to spin up Visual Studio at all, right? Like maybe I'm only doing, some JavaScript development and don't want to use Visual Studio at all. So like I don't want to have to open it just so I hit F5 to run IIS Express or to kick off IIS Express. So from a laziness factor, I like to use the full-on internet server.
Yeah, I've actually had problems by doing that before because the IIS Express is pretty good about not having problems with different file types and MIME types, like say like WAF font files or if you do sort of downloads and you upload your site to a new server or version of IIS and suddenly your downloads aren't working anymore, or you're not getting your web fonts because of that little stuff you need to set up on the server there, and you may totally take that for granted and not know what's going on at deploy time.
Yeah, it becomes a big deal. Like those little tiny nuances can mean the difference between downtime or a stable running site. So
yep. And there's a really great table on the 12factor.net website where they kind of talk about traditional apps and 12-factor apps and how they are different in this step. And one thing they mentioned, there's three things, but the first one is the time between deployments. In a traditional app, that can be weeks and even longer if you're dealing with something like different versions of Windows or whatever. I guess that's changed a lot now, but with the 12-factor app, you're really aiming for deploys every couple hours, if not more often. And so it's really important to keep your dev environment as close to production as possible and basically pull master often.
I'm curious though, and I don't know that I saw anything in here on this, but in the case that you have a product that's running multiple versions in different spots, like could you even, like you have a customer that has a version out here And you have a customer who has version
That's not a 12-factor app
at all, right? That's what I was going to say. Like,
no,
it
because
does,
these are all like web,
yeah.
The 12-factor app, like a lot of these are written in the mindset that this is just a .com,
an internal
right?
application or something. Yeah.
Maybe not, maybe internal, but just it's treated as a .com. Is my point.
Okay.
But specifically, this section, excuse me, reminded me of a story that I remember reading a long time ago, and I went back and looked for it to find it. And it was around how Facebook does their deployments. Now, they have since changed greatly. This was an article written in 2012. So this is back when they were still doing compiled PHP. And when they would do their releases, they would do several, I think the article said they did at least a couple a day, and then like the major ones were done once a week or something like that. I'll have a link available for you. But their releases were like when they would. One of the cool things about this was that back in 2012, they would compile all of Facebook.com into a single file, right? And that single file was 1.5 gig in size. Now, your Facebook.com, you're scaled across the world, and you got to distribute 1.5 gig across every server in your infrastructure in order to get your latest version out, right? So they were using this really cool idea of using BitTorrent to distribute everything. Now, specifically as it relates to the 12-factor thing, one thing where I was trying to remember was that, like, where was it that the whole process to put out that version of Facebook was like 30 minutes in total, right? But I thought I couldn't find it, but I thought there was a part where it talked about, like, as the developers were working on their fix, right? And maybe I'm thinking of an Amazon story, but like they could push out their fix right then and there as soon as they committed the ticket, or like whatever their ticketing system was. But while I couldn't find that as it related to the 12-factor, this article still did relate in one way, and that was that one of the factors here was that the authors of the code in this graph that Joe was talking about, like the traditional versus the 12-factor app, the authors of the code versus the deployers of the code in a traditional app were different people, but in the 12-factor app, it's the same people. And specifically, this article about the Facebook deployments, they specifically talk about, like, the person who wrote the code that's going out in that deployment, they own it. It's
right.
theirs. And they have to be around at the time that the deployments are going out. And if there's any problem as a result of their change, then they are responsible for fixing it. Like, they gotta own it. So I liked that ownership part of, like, hey, if you're willing to write the code, you're willing to commit it and work on that ticket and put it out there, then you have to own it and see that it goes all the way into production, right?
It makes a lot of sense.
Which
really.
was something I really like about the 12-factor app, because I really like that. I'm sure we've all been in that situation where, you've worked with someone, they write some code, but then they disappear, and it comes time to do a production deployment, and you don't know, like, well, you hope that it's okay because it's in whatever your master trunk is, right? But when it comes time to deploy it, and you're like, how do I even test this thing? Like, what is it? It doesn't seem like it's working, and you can't find this person. Like, that's a problem. And so I really liked the ownership part of it, and the fact that the 12-factor app specifically called it out as, you wrote it, you deploy it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, because if a problem does come up, if you're intimately familiar with it, you know exactly where to go, right? I mean, it's that's a big deal.
Yeah, and not only that, but you might also be aware of, like, maybe there are issues that are, how to say this, like, acceptable, issues,
edge cases
that,
or something.
That someone who's not familiar with it, when it comes time to do the deployment, they might be like, oh my God, this pixel's in the wrong place. And you're like, whoa, time out. Yeah, we know that it's 2 pixels to the right when it should be to the left, and we're going to fix that. right? We already got a ticket for that,
In the
but for
next
right now we
release,
don't care.
right, yeah.
And actually, too, this article specifically called that out, and which is why I was, to your point about, how did you just phrase that a moment ago when you mentioned multiple versions to different clients?
Oh yeah, like you have a different version of an app deployed somewhere, then you can't really have development be what production is because you have multiple versions.
Like specifically in this Facebook article, they had mentioned that reverting back to other versions was for losers, right? Like you always roll forward, and I felt like that was really like the 12-factor app also kind of falls in line with that too,
Yeah.
right? And I think we've mentioned that before too. Like you just roll forward and fix it there. And so they specifically talked about like when there are those acceptable issues, right? That rolling back a version that the person being interviewed from Facebook in this article made the analogy that rolling back a version would be the same as pulling the brake line on the train, right? Like
You just don't do it.
yeah.
Hey,
You,
I will
you don't
say,
do it unless it's an emergency.
this brings up a little bit of a side tangent, but hey, I've worked at and with people and at places where like the knee jerk reaction is a rollback, and I can honestly say that in probably 95% of the time that is the wrong reaction.
And now you got documentation to prove. Call them out and say they're a loser.
Right. No, but I mean, in all honesty, like if there is a problem, if it's something that's going to bring you down for a day and it's going to affect a lot of, money, then maybe it's something that you consider having a rollback for, right? But if it's something that you can solve in a reasonably quick amount of time, and especially if you're working with engineers you trust and they are involved in the release cycle, then they can probably figure out pretty quickly what's going on. And a lot of times rolling forward is less painful than rolling back. So, taking that extra
It really
time,
depends on your infrastructure.
It can depend on a lot of things, right?
Yeah, like what's your deployment infrastructure like? Yeah.
Right.
But then there's also the argument that could be made too that like, an opportunity, like let's say that Facebook has a bug, right? Well, their monetary bug is going to be more like ad loss, type of
Right.
revenue, right?
As opposed to
Versus
Amazon.
if it's Amazon.com, then the revenue lost is huge
It's
because
massive.
on some potential sales. So, yeah, I just thought it was interesting that their stance was, rolling back was for losers.
Yeah. And again, you just brought up a key differentiator there. I mean, depending on what that means to your site, right? Like if you're
Right.
Shopify, you can't have it down, right? Like you're affecting hundreds or thousands of storefronts. You can't screw with that. Facebook, okay, so people can't see what their friend said, 30 seconds ago.
But you know who's going to be best to be able to evaluate that problem quickly? The guy who coded it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
he should
Always.
be involved in the deployment.
Always. Yep. So,
Yay, 12-factor. All right, so sorry about that. We're coming back from a technical difficulty there. That's never happened. Usually all of the bits from Florida are able to make it up here to Georgia, but for some reason the internets didn't allow that, and so we had to resolve that issue.
yeah.
Well, I think it's more of a problem with Georgia receiving, but
Oh, wait.
That's very possible.
that's right. But in the interest of keeping things moving right along, I just wanted to say that the key points for me is basically just minding the gap here. Release early and often. Keep the programmers close to operations, and take care to make sure your environments are as close to exact as possible. And one thing we haven't really mentioned with this whole thing we kind of took for granted though is with this whole 12-factor act, they're really kind of counting on you being an agile shop. Like there's no room for waterfall here.
Oh no. No. Yeah, this requires hourly dual every 2-hour releases. That doesn't happen in Waterfall.
No, you can't schedule releases like that. That would just be crazy. You'd have to have like at least 300 meetings before every release.
Yeah, this and that's the we've talked about this before especially at the beginning where like some of these chapters were okay for like any type of app development, right? And every now and then you can see the tone that was initially set, or the intention that was initially set, where, like you were saying, it was really for agile environments or for .com type environments. And this is definitely one of those where it's like release often, right? Where, that didn't happen in earlier days of an operating system, for example.
No.
It's getting there, though. It is kind of getting there as the pieces are distributed more modularly. But yeah, it's been a long road.
Yep. And speaking of long roads, we mentioned this Clearly Tech article pretty much with every other step we've done. And basically, they've gone through and assigned an importance rating to each of these steps that we like to talk about. And so what do you guys think they assigned for the DevProd parity?
Okay, I may have cheated.
Yeah, I have now only because of the technical difficulty. But my original answer would have been high. Like, I would have thought this would have been high on the chain of things that should be, done
I'm high as well.
Yeah, I was really surprised. This one came in as a medium, and I, too, thought that this one was going to be treated as high. But, yeah, they only had it at a medium, and their answer was that developers will feel like taking shortcuts if their local environment is working well enough, and to talk them out of it and take a hardline stance, and it'll pay off in the long term. But
yeah, that just doesn't strike me as the right thing. Like, one of the things that we didn't touch on, and I'll just briefly say it right now, is like they said a lot of times instead of using the full-blown SQL database, they might use a SQLite or something, right?
Right.
And that goes back into those same type of problems that you're going to run into that you wouldn't have had if you had been using the same type
Like full
thing.
text indexing isn't going to be available
Right,
on the light
right.
version.
So that, I don't know, medium seems a little bit low for me on this one.
But if my database is in a cluster, I'm not going to have a cluster locally, am I?
Yeah, you can. You could.
But
I mean, it might be a little bit of work, but
I think here's where the rub is for me on this one, though, is that this chapter, there were, as we discussed, there were 3 distinct parts to this, right? There was the time, the personnel, and the tools gap. And in keeping the developers close to the deployment, right, that whole ownership of it, that is very near and dear to me, very important to me. And so that was a big part of the reason why I was like, I really want this one to be high. I really want this one to be important. Right. That's my opinion on it.
Yep. But I can get behind it being medium. I mean, there's things I worked on that I just could not have a local environment for, like SharePoint farms and just like kind of strange environments that I'm not going to be able to feasibly have for a small feature. So you basically do as best you can to mock it and hope QA catches any problems.
yeah.
But if you've got a QA step, then you're probably not being very full factor app, I guess. It's not a whole lot of room for that here.
So I think this next one, though, I think what we're about to step into, this might be Joe's favorite thing.
Yes.
I may be wrong, but we're gonna.
I feel like we're in a Ren and Stimpy commercial here for log.
Yeah.
Oh, this is one of those things that I
It's
like. I love.
It's log. It's fun for a boy and a girl.
It's better than bad. It's good.
Yes.
See,
This is better than bad. It's good.
So
I
this is
I wasn't
basically.
sure if that was going to go over well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh no, I love log. Everyone should have log.
I mean, it is Star Wars season. You should get one for all the family members.
Oh,
So man, let me tell you, I love logs and I hate not having logs. And for as much as I hate not having logs, I'm terrible about actually having the appropriate level.
It's either too much is logged,
Yep.
or not nearly enough is logged. There's never a happy medium there.
Yeah, and I've actually been in situations where I was logging too much, and it actually would slow the app down, and so I would do something like stop logging, and things would dramatically speed up.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, especially if you're running a console and you're actually seeing things printing to screen, it can have a noticeable effect.
Oh yeah.
But it looks so good streaming, right? You feel like you're in the
Yeah.
Matrix.
That's right.
Tail log. And you got like 80 of those going.
Yep.
Yeah, like the Whopper's playing its own version of tic-tac-toe by itself as you watch all the logs fly by, and it's
Right.
guessing the random password to launch the nuke.
That's right. But they actually had some really cool things that kind of set apart their advice on logs from kind of traditional, or at least what I think of as being traditional. And their big point there was treating logs as event streams. and specifically getting away from files. They want you to log to basically your console. So just standard error and standard out.
Yeah.
You just kind of do your console.log. It's great for while you're working on it because you see it right there in your IDE or somewhere nearby. And you can do all your sort of file rolling and aggregation and streaming and writing the files and file management and rolling logs. All that sort of stuff can be handled outside of your application. Your application doesn't have to know anything about any of that.
They said that, but I wasn't quite on board with it.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I was kind of curious, especially like in the days of like APIs like a log4net, right? Or a log4j. Like, I'm such a fan of that I was like, no, wait, why do I want to get rid of that and just write it all out the console?
So I thought about that actually quite a bit. And one thing that they really emphasize in some of the earlier steps is being able to have like multiple instances of your application on one box. And when you start doing stuff like that, then it gets hard to have like a single place kind of configured for logs. Like you want to be able to have this stuff right out to different areas. It could just be
like an environment variable per instance that would define what the log path was, right?
Well, like give it a GUID or something, and every time you restart the app, it goes to a different folder.
Well, it sounds like though the difference though is what they're saying is you just log to the standard out, right? And then in each environment, that environment decides what to do with it. So yeah, you're talking like
they're talking about like redirecting it. Redirecting if you want to capture that out to a file, then fine, you can redirect standard out or standard error out to your choice, right?
But you do that in the environment. What you're talking about with like log4net or what was the
log4j?
Log4j, but there was another one, logback in Java. So instead of using those libraries to set that kind of stuff up through your app, they're saying no, you just do your standard out and then you let the environment handle it, right? And that kind of makes sense to a certain degree because now no matter where you put this thing, you can have that environment set up to do things a specific way for that environment, right? As opposed to letting your application handle it, which means if you ever want to change how that log is handled, you've now got to redeploy your app.
I guess this is where I took issue with it, is that the whole point of the Apache Log4net project or Log4j project is that based on configuration, you could have different outputs for your logs. So if you want your application to suddenly be logging to do all of its logging to a database, then you just configure in the configuration, you configure it to write to SQL Server. Or if you want it sending emails, you configure that in the Log4net configuration. Or if you want it writing out to a file, or if you want it writing out to the console, or if you want it writing out to console with colors.
Or if you want it to do all of them at the same time, it can.
Yep.
But yes, you could.
Yeah.
But all of that was configuration driven.
Which doesn't break the 12-factor thing either.
Well, but here they're saying
don't do it.
But here they are. Yeah, no. Because here they're saying write it out to standard out or standard error.
Right.
And so there's only the one output ever. And so you just hit on one where like if you wanted to write it out to a console, if you're running it by console and you wanted to write it out to a file, or if you want to write like you could only have the one choice
right
with this option that they present.
Yep. Although you can have a console appender basically, so you can run through something like Log4j and still have it just write the console, and then you get all the benefits of having like the different levels of logging, like debug or info, and you can still have the nice timestamp and formatting, and you still end up writing the standard out.
Yeah, this is an interesting take on it. Like I don't know that I'd throw away Logback or Log4net or any of those because they do add. And like you said, it's configuration driven, which I don't remember which one part of the 12-factor app was. They were like, hey, things should be config driven so that you can just change a config, right?
It was chapter 3.
Yeah, so I'm maybe, I don't know. I can't think that these kind of libraries didn't exist when they did this. I'm not real certain. Maybe it also has to do
again, consider
with
the
speed.
source.
It might also have to do with speed, though. If we think about it, if all you're doing is writing to standard out, there's no drag on your application. It's now on your environment as opposed to the app.
There's a drag on your application if you start writing out a standard out while it's in the console. Yeah, there's totally a drag on it. But
it depends on how you set up your environment to do it, right? There's no overhead in your app is what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying? So if you have a log4net, there's a bit of overhead because it's now managing how your logs get written and that kind of information.
Yeah, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make though is that like you rely on those kind of third party libraries because they're already trying to optimize themselves for when should I flush to disk or when should I not, things like that. Versus if you're just doing a simple redirection, then you're losing some of those performance efficiencies that third party API might have been doing for you, in addition to the flexibility of, okay, let me also have the logging send out to an email on certain conditions, right?
Right.
So that's all lost.
But they have Logplex and Fluent that they mentioned, which I'm not familiar with either one of these things for Heroku. So I would imagine that these kind of do the same type thing, but
well, and this is why I was like, this is why I was saying consider the source. Is that okay? So we're getting close to the end of the year here, and as part of getting close to the end of the year, it's going to be that stupid resolution time. And
Yes.
Last year at this time, I had said, hey, I should probably like take the time and put in the effort to learn Rails. And I never did. But the guys at Heroku did. And so I don't know if maybe that's where they're coming from, is that maybe they don't have, I mean, I would find it crazy that there's not a good logging package out there, but maybe there isn't. And that's why they were saying like, hey, in our experience, we've just found it best. Even that there might be some third party, logging packages out there, just go to standard out and be done with it. I don't know.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I wouldn't stop using Log4j or Log4net or Logback or any of those because they add that, like we said,
Right.
They give you the ability through configs to set up something that you can easily change and stream to multiple places, which might be a performance hit, but you could do it.
So starting tomorrow, we're going to document the 11-factor app.
11.5.
With no logs.
That's right, no logs.
Well, at least we can all agree that they're right on about treating logs as event streams.
Yeah.
Right, and whether that means Log4j or console, standard out, then that's another point.
Yeah, it should be. You should be able to retrace what happened. That's the whole point of them.
Well, if because they made the point about letting some other tool route the logging and to not clutter up your app with with the file management of the log. So if by that they include the third party app, then a third party library like a Log4j or Log4net, then yeah.
Okay.
One of the notes that we had here that I think is truly relevant, and people that aren't aware of them, hopefully this will come up for you eventually, is if you have multiple servers, especially like in this 12-factor app, right? Like the whole point is to be able to scale horizontally. And so now you have logs potentially going to multiple different places, right? You don't necessarily want to have a shared server because you can't scale that properly. So you might have logs across 30 different servers. Well, in order to actually be able to use that,
if you're Netflix, you might not know how many servers you
have.
Yeah,
they literally scale those up and down, once every couple of days, several an hour, and they only stay alive for a day or two. So these files may be all over the place. And even if you have a small web app that you might be hosting internally at your own company, even trying to go across 5 different servers to try and aggregate those logs is frustrating, right? You need something like Splunk or Logstash, which are set up to be able to suck in these logs and aggregate them together, so they bring them all into one searchable spot. So
Splunk is amazing.
Splunk is.
If you're not using Splunk, I can't say Logstash because I've had no experience with it, unfortunately. But Splunk is amazing. Yeah, you can do some Here's an example though that you didn't mention though, like in your you have the multiple servers and you're trying to like aggregate the data across all of them. What about in the case of like security problems?
Oh yeah,
right. Like you're trying to trace a potential security vulnerability or a potential intrusion, right? Like if you have n number of servers,
Yep.
and you have to go through each one of them independently,
You'll never
that'd
find
be a
it.
nightmare. Yeah. So having it aggregated together in something like a Splunk is very helpful.
Yeah, and not to go too far into it. I mean, it really is amazing software. Again, it's not super cheap, but you can even have it do things like alert you for like what you were talking about with the security thing. You have it look for particular events, and you can actually have it send alerts out if it finds something, right? So pretty amazing stuff. I also have not used Logstash, so I'm not sure how well it fits in, but another popular solution out there.
Yeah.
Yep. So what do you think about the importance rating for this one? Well, first of all, what do you think that Clearly Tech gave it?
I
Probably
accidentally
something
read.
I won't agree with.
Right.
I mean, I gotta say logs are high, man. Like, how could you not have logging in your environment?
I'm between medium and high myself because, especially for a production type environment where you're not typically allowed to get hands on into like data and that kind of stuff, how else are you going to retrace the steps, right? In any kind of meaningful way. And that's why I guess depending on the type of environment, this would definitely either be a medium or a high for me.
Well, okay, so retracing the steps from a debugging perspective, but if you're any kind of financial, whether it be a bank or an e-commerce, I would imagine that you pretty much have to for regulation purposes.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not an option. Not having a log isn't an option.
Well, I mean, think about if you're wiring money, right? Like you need to know every step of the way exactly what happened. Now, whether or not
some of that
that's
might
stored
be
in a database,
traced elsewhere.
it might be
I meant like
databases.
more connectivity type of tracing.
Right.
Like IP addresses that were coming in. Like things that you might find in a typical log.
vulnerabilities and
right?
stuff. Yeah.
Well, like one teller is logged in from 5 different states and running, looking up customers at a rate of like 10 per second or something.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I view this as like it's a high. I don't see how it could not be.
Yeah, I guess
you're probably going to say this is why I said like you're probably going to tell me it's an answer that I don't agree with, Joe.
Yep. They have as a low.
What?
And the reasoning is basically if you are, just reading this from the site, if you are relying on logs as a primary forensic tool, you are probably already missing out on better solutions. Be sure to consolidate your logs for convenience, but beyond that, don't worry about being a purist here. And they're not saying don't log, and they're not saying don't aggregate, but I think that they're basically saying don't rely on logs as your primary means of debugging, which I still don't agree with, really. But, I definitely I can't see this being any lower than a medium.
Yeah, that's what I said. Like, depending on the circumstance, maybe a medium's fine, but I can't see it being any lower than that.
I kind of find it interesting that like in the example that I gave, and then the forensic tool was one of the their choices of wording in that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But if you take it from the perspective of of course you have logs, but whether or not it's written to standard out, then I could see them kind of grading this lower and getting away with it. But definitely logs are wonderful, and if you've ever, and I'm sure you have, if you've been programming for any length of time, dealt with situation where you don't have any logs or you don't have good enough logs, and all you have is it's broke, figured out, and you can't reproduce the problem, then you know how horrible that is.
Right.
All right, so that's it for logging. And now it's time for our call to action. So we would love for you to leave us a review if you haven't already. And the reason is it's basically our primary way of finding new listeners. It's really helpful to us, and it's been helpful, and we would love for it to continue being helpful. So we really appreciate it. And also, if you already have left us a review, please feel free to share the podcast with your coworkers or friends.
Yeah, and you can leave us a review by going to www.codingblocks.net/review. We made it real easy. So you can leave it on your platform of choice, iTunes, Stitcher, and we don't know of any other ones. If anybody does, that'd be awesome if they told us, but I don't know where any other review places
Someday we'll finish getting up on SoundCloud.
Yeah.
Did you mention Overcast?
No, I have not.
Overcast? I don't know. There's all kinds.
Yeah, there's
Overcast, Player FM, Stitcher, iTunes.
Yeah, we're all over the place.
SoundCloud.
Yep. SoundCloud, not quite as fully as others. But yeah, one day I'll finish uploading the rest of those episodes.
All right. This episode is sponsored by Infragistics. Experts in data visualization, Infragistics developer tools drive custom app development for any data visualization scenario on any platform. And Report Plus is an enterprise-ready self-service BI dashboard solution that opens up your enterprise big data for end-user consumption. Head over to Infragistics.com and get your free trial today. All right, so before we head into this last chapter of the 12 Factor, I wanted to have a little bit of fun here because we didn't mention the polls. And we've had 2 episodes since this last one, and I thought, this would be kind of interesting, right? Because once again, we forgot to mention or even think of what a poll could be for this episode. But when we do that, and I happen to be the guy in charge of putting the show notes together, I'm like, well, I'm going to have fun with it. So in episode 34, I'd said, well, why do these guys keep forgetting to think up a survey? And the options were Call of Duty Black Ops 3, Destiny the Taken King, or Halo 5 Guardians. Now, because I'm sure that you guys didn't cheat, and don't you dare do it now, Alan.
Not looking. I'm good.
All right, what do you think? What do you think it is? Call of Duty, Destiny, or Halo 5?
Call of Duty.
Our listeners, I'm going to go with Destiny.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Wow, from left field. Well, Joe is right.
See, that's what I prefer.
54.5% Call of Duty Black Ops 3.
Very nice.
And they wouldn't be wrong. That's the thing.
All right.
I haven't bought the game yet.
Oh my God. So, well, okay. I felt a little bit lied to about the zombies campaign because I don't remember if I read it or watched it. I definitely think I had some conversations with local, GameStop store. But there was supposed to be a whole campaign mode for zombies that was supposed to be more like the traditional campaign, or the gameplay was supposed to be a normal campaign. I really didn't feel like it was. I felt like, I'm like, what are they talking about? This is the same exact type of zombie campaign in terms of gameplay as what you had, for example, in Advanced Warfare, right?
So redoing monotonous shooting zombies trying to get into the house type thing.
You're definitely thinking of older zombies.
Okay, I don't remember.
Than current.
That turned
Call
me
of
off
Duty.
forever.
But what I'm saying is that let's narrow it down just to Black Ops 3 and Advanced Warfare, since those are the most recent ones. Both of those versions, if you were going to do a quote campaign in the zombie mode, then you would start from the beginning, and it's kind of like Super Mario Brothers. You either get to the end with your set amount of lives, or you don't, and you start over.
Yeah,
right? It's not like the campaign mode in, the normal campaign mode where, you're like, hey, you know what? I want to stop here and call it a night, and I'll come back to it. It's not like that, right?
Yeah.
It unless I missed something, but
that's no.
I was
fun.
kind of disappointed in that because I was hoping for a multiple storyline, but yeah. And I will say, I don't know. Have you played it, Joe? Have you played Black Ops 3?
Nope.
No? Okay. The one thing that Advanced Warfare really had that I so badly miss in Black Ops 3, and I can't believe they took it away, was the firing range. As you're, putting your gun together, you're customizing it, you're putting on, what sight you want on it, the grip you want on, whatever options you want to customize your weapon, right? You then just go over to the firing range, try it out, see if you like it, and then go shoot people in multiplayer, right? You can't do that in Black Ops 3. It's like old school where, you don't know how the gun's going to perform until it's too late and you got a bullet in your face.
I never did the firing range.
Really?
I always went straight into battle, dude.
Really?
I was like, I got this gun. Let's go use it.
No way, man. That was especially
But
especially once you got royalty on the gun and you're like, oh, cool. What does this look like in gameplay mode? I would jump into the firing range and just spin around like, oh, this is what it's going to look like. Cool.
Let me go ahead and break this down for you, though. So we were at a place the other day, and they have a PS4 sitting there,
Oh,
right?
God. What's happening?
And they have some controllers, so they have Black Ops.
Advanced Warfare.
Advanced Warfare. All right. So most normal people, aka me, you, we'd sit down, we'd be like, all right, let's grab one of these built-in classes and let's rock. Right?
Oh my god.
Dude, like 15
Nobody.
minutes later, I was
It was
snoring.
not
I was
15
snoring
minutes later.
beside Outlaw as he's over there setting up his class. He's picking out the
No
right
way,
grenades.
man.
He's setting up his score perks, dude. Like, I'm like, dude,
He's exaggerating.
dude, are we playing today? Or,
Joe,
or
he's totally
like, do I need to
exaggerating.
come back later? Maybe I need to hit a bio break.
it-
I'll be back.
I know what gun I want and what options I want. It was more like maybe 2 minutes.
Dude, he even spent time like molding the person's face. Like
Oh,
it took
my
forever, man.
God. I mean, that is one of
who
the
voted.
that is one of the cool things about Advanced Warfare is you do get to like pick your outfits.
Dude,
for your
I'm
guy,
not
you
even
know? So
kidding,
you got to
like,
dress him
I
appropriately.
went and played a game of ping pong and came back and was still waiting.
That never happened. That never happened.
Oh,
But you know what did happen was Advanced Warfare,
Uh,
and I forgot how much I loved that game though.
that game's fun.
Like when we played that game for the few minutes that we were there.
well, we
it
could have
totally,
been playing for like 30 minutes.
Oh, my God.
But it
but it totally made me think like, because at first, I think I wanted to like Black Ops a lot more than I did, but it has definitely grown on me since. But like, you ever have that thing where like you don't want to be that person who doesn't like change, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes you find yourself, you're like, oh man, I don't like that they changed it. Why did they do that? And then you kind of step back and you're like, whoa, you're that guy that suddenly doesn't like change. And so you try not to be, but I really wanted to like Black Ops 3, and then I kind of was like, but I really so liked Advanced Warfare. Why can't this be exactly like Advanced Warfare and just call it Black Ops 3? But now it's kind of growing on me.
Yeah.
You know?
So I think the key takeaway here is if you voted for Call of Duty, you were right.
Yes, yeah, you were totally right. And so then there was the episode 35 poll, which again, we didn't have a survey for it, so it must have been somebody's fault. So your choices were, it's Alan's fault, it's Joe's fault, or it's Michael's fault.
was definitely Michael's fault.
Really?
Yeah, it absolutely.
All right. What do you think, Joe?
I'm going to say Michael's only because sometimes people seem to confuse me with Michael.
What?
Were we right?
So, okay.
He's not going to answer us.
So I want to have a talk with you, dear listener, right now,
That means we were right.
because more than 46% picked me. That it was my fault that there wasn't a survey. And the funny thing is that like at first, when the survey was out and the votes were coming in, like I was kind of like chuckling to myself because I was the one that put the survey out there, and initially they were coming in as either like all Alan or all Joe, and I was like, oh, this is kind of funny. None of them have been for me yet, and then they all started coming in for me.
Well, that was because nobody had listened yet. They'd only downloaded.
Oh, whatever. I was like, wait a minute, why me? Like, who do you think came in last then out of that one?
Me.
Really, you? You think so?
Me. No, it's
Wow,
Joe.
you're
Joe's a
pretty
nice
cocky.
guy. It's Joe.
I'm going to say just me because whenever something is wrong, they tend to blame my wrongness on you somehow.
On me?
yeah, I
So
think
like
it
if
was
my
actually
levels
Joe.
are bad, it like gets attributed to you for some reason.
Joe's like the nice guy.
I think Joe needs to say his name like right now.
This is Joe.
Hi.
I am Joe.
Hi, my name's Joe Zach.
I think before Joe says anything from now on for the remainder of the episode, every time that he's about to say something, he should say, "This is Joe."
This is Joe. Yeah.
Yeah. So Joe was only 23%. He was in last.
Oh, that means I wasn't too far above him. I was like 26,
Yeah, you're in the
27.
middle.
Yeah. But by
I didn't like that I had such a commanding lead.
Yeah, I was gonna say like you doubled us up, man.
that. I was like, wait a minute.
That's amazing. Thank you, listeners.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, guys. Thanks.
So you're welcome. All right. So now let's get into the last chapter of the 12-factor app, which is admin processes.
All right, and basically the deal here is to run admin or management tasks as one-off processes And what they're really talking about here is basically keeping these associated with the application and keeping it in line with that dev prod parity, or I guess it's kind of like a prod parity, but basically keeping this stuff with your application so that it stays in sync. If you've ever been somewhere that had shared code deployed to like a separate server for tasks, then you know the pain that they're addressing here. And it's basically like you put out a new version of your site, but you forget to update the tasks, or vice versa. These things just get out of sync if you don't take great care to keep them together. But if you're running these tasks as kind of like little maybe scripts or something in the directory of your web root, then you can kind of keep this stuff all together, and this stuff can be a website or be used to run these little one-off processes.
Yeah, I mean, a true story behind this, like what you were talking about, having a shared environment where you just have these things run. It is so easy for something to have been running perfectly for a year. Your app is now, umpteen versions later, and now you need to update this thing. Basically, that code base that was there a year ago no longer exists. And so now it's a major effort, right? Like you have to go update this thing again. You have to go. It can become a bit of a pain. So like this whole thing running it off the same code base as what you've got out there now and keeping it with the app, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yep. So if you've got something like, say, you've got a search engine or something, you've got a process that generates a feed every so often, then you want this process to be in sync with the shared code for your, say, website. And if you've ever been in a situation where you update the website and the feed breaks or vice versa, then it sucks.
Yep.
I think the one part that I got maybe stuck on in this chapter though was that there's this line where they say that the 12-factor app strongly favors languages which provide a read eval print loop. And I was like, well, that's kind of an unfortunate statement. Like, why does it need to favor that in order for all of these other great chapters to to adhere to all these other great chapters to be a 12-factor app? Why is that necessary? And I don't know that I ever came up with an answer for that, at least in my own head.
Yeah, to me, it's like, I understand why it'd be nice to kind of have a shell right there that you can interact with your shared code in real time. And I understand why with like a traditional static language like Java or C#, why you wouldn't want like an executable or a jar there that you'd have to, build and interact with. But I don't like this. To me, I don't know of any static languages that have a REPL really, at least not a useful one. It seems kind of like a hacky thing to say. Like, why should I be interacting with a REPL in production?
Yeah, I mean, and that's another good point too. I feel like if you're in production, you probably, especially if you've gone the way of the 12-factor app, then chances are all of these boxes being spun up should be automated. You're not even touching these. So the fact that why would you even be logged into a box to be in one of these, read eval print loop shells, at all, right?
Yeah. I do get that it's faster to be able to say just in a little script file, import the libraries I need and do these 3 actions compared to C# where you have to create an executable and there's going to be an app config and, stuff like that is just kind of annoying to deal with. But I'm not crazy about this one, and I think they're kind of the website bias is showing through again.
Well, and the language choice,
Right.
Yep.
I mean, I did like that. I think I read it somewhere on one of these where it was saying that in this section too that these scripts would be deployed along. They would be part of the code base and deployed along with it. So like every box. If you had one of these admin scripts, right, for example, then every deployment got that script, right? So they're all at parity with one another, right?
Yep. Yeah, and it's true. Even by saying REPL, I definitely feel like I hear that a lot more for Ruby. Like Python, I hear like interactive shell, and even for JavaScript, you don't really hear people talking about REPL.
And that's why I keep referring to it like spelled out rather than saying it like that, right?
Right.
Like, a read eval print loop so that for those that aren't familiar with it, that have never experienced it. But basically, okay, so I guess in fairness, if you haven't, what we're talking about there with a read eval print loop is, let's say that you were to just type in, let's say you're a Perl developer and you would normally type in Perl and whatever your script name is to execute it, unless you're on a Linux environment, which we'll forget. Maybe you have the at the top of the script you have the interpreter listed there, but let's forget about that for a moment. You might just say like Perl and then your script name and to execute it. But in a read eval print loop, you would just type in Perl and then it would enter into a Perl shell environment where you could enter in Perl language constructs and it would execute them there, right? You could do Python the same way, right? Like there's several of these, but languages like C#, for example, are not going to be one of them. Java is not going to be one of them, right?
Yep. And I mean, there's hacks in place. There's tools that you can use to kind of have REPL-like environments. And I know there's like C# script and source stuff like that. But that stuff isn't really common. It's not the kind of stuff that you're going to have hanging around in production.
Yeah.
But I just thought the REPL thing was interesting, and not too fond of that sentiment.
Yeah, like I said, it may have just been me. I don't know about for you two, but it definitely, like, once I read that part, I was like just sidetracked. I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah,
lost all train of thought. Squirrel. So.
Yep, and clearly tech.com, they had a nice little snippet here I was going to read, and basically the idea is that usually a developer will run these sort of tasks, and when they do, they should be doing it from a machine in the production environment that's running the latest version of production code, and they should be doing that instead of, from a local environment or something like that. And an example here I think is like something like clearing the cache. These are developer-oriented tasks, things that you might want to do just kind of, right now, or if there's some sort of problem or something. And so I like the idea that I can kind of, SSH into production and, kick off a script. And, so it's cool. And I like that you don't have to worry about the code being out of date like you do if you have separate deployments. And I like that there's basically one code base instead of like separate installation types for things that do tasks or things that run websites.
Yeah. Again, I guess it's like the frame of mind that you're in as you're reading it, because like I said, that one section, or that one mention about the REPL definitely threw me off. And then there was also, like I said too, this other frame of thought that I was in where it's like, if I'm thinking about this from the point of view of a app that is, let's think about like a cloud-based app, right? If you're thinking about a cloud-based app that's going to scale up or down based on demand, right? Then that should be completely automated, right? Mm-hmm. No one is going to be SSHing into any one of these boxes, right? They shouldn't, that access shouldn't exist for them. They shouldn't even know, what box it is. Like that's not even something that should be happening if you're in that kind of environment. So then why do I need these admin processes there that I'm going to be SSHing into to execute, that I need this read eval print loop for? So I guess where I'm going with that is that in the Clearly Tech, from an importance point of view, like I kind of ranked this one as low.
Yep, same here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the biggest issue for me is basically the prod parity issue, where you have different install locations and therefore different versions of code that are possibly running your tasks. But aside from that, I feel like if you do have a separate kind of install location for tasks and separate locations for your websites, you will get bit. But maybe not so often, and maybe it won't matter that much. So I think this one's a low to medium.
That's where I fell on this one. Because to what Outlaw said, like if you've got 50 of these things spun up, should a developer really be logging in and running these scripts? I could see if you had like some sort of chef thing to where it kicked them off when it got spun up, but that's not the whole point of this REPL loop, right? Like the whole point of that was so you could get user feedback, and then that doesn't really make sense. So yeah, I would say this one's a low to a medium.
Yeah,
And,
so
they have
I'll buy
that's-
that with the, especially with the chef from Puppet kind of example where you're wanting to script out what the configuration of the system is, and you want some tasks that will be executed as part of maybe that you want to
The spin
coincide with the version.
Yep.
So they should all be deployed to every instance
Yep.
and be part of the code base. So I agree with that. So yeah, I'll stand by low to medium.
they give it a high.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
But
That's
their
it. We're
reasoning,
No, like literally.
yeah, I feel like this last step is kind of a fizzle. I wish logging was the last one.
Oh,
But
we should have swapped it. We should have swapped it. Swapped it. Swapped it.
we should have flipped it.
We should have swapped it around.
So their reasoning, though, is basically saying having console access to a production system is a critical administrative and debugging tool, and every major language and framework provides it, so no excuse for sloppiness here.
I disagree. Having
Yeah, it's
console access
kinda-
to a production system is
It's
a critical
crazy.
administrative and debug. Like, no.
Especially with REPL, you can really mess stuff up, if you accidentally, run a delete operation or something.
Well, that's the greatest chance of where you're going to have a security hole.
Yeah.
If you're allowing,
oh, yeah,
like,
true.
production console access to your production system, there's your greatest chance for being hacked.
Yeah.
Like, that should be locked down.
Yep.
So
And I actually
going back to
consider
low.
logging into production and modifying things via REPL. I consider that kind of sloppy. So, yeah, I'm not crazy about their definition here, but I'm not really crazy about this whole factor.
All right, so we're down to 10 factors.
yes,
Yeah.
we've chopped them.
I think there actually might have been a couple others that we didn't quite agree with. But
That's true. But we have gone through all of them. So that's it. Tonight we went over dev prod parity, logs, and admin processes. So do you guys have a favorite of the 12?
ooh, good question.
Mine was probably the config one. I really like the whole idea of having configs or environment
Yep.
variables set up. The whole I forget. I don't even think it was part of the 12 factor thing, but the whole don't commit anything you wouldn't want to accidentally get open sourced. Like that is so like crucial to making sure that you don't have like major security gaps. But I do like the whole, deploy an app that you can change things on the fly without redeploying an app. Like that is huge to me.
Yeah.
Yep. I like Codebase too, keeping your basically your application, each application separate in its own separate repository.
Yeah, I like,
that was a
I
good
liked that
one.
one too. Actually, what I was going to say was like the first 3 chapters started off very strong.
Yep.
And then the fizzle kind of came and went, depending on the
It was-
chapter.
Yeah.
Codebase dependencies and config. I also
Definitely
I really
was
liked-
not like port binding, concurrency, and disposability were like probably my least favorite.
Yeah, but then I did like 10 and 11 a lot. So that's dev prod parity and logs.
Yeah, those are both good. Very good.
Yeah.
Yep,
It
and,
was definitely
processes.
interesting though, and I definitely am thankful that they took the time to put that out there because I mean they're coming from a particular mindset, but a lot of experience in a one particular realm of app development, right? So it was interesting to see like what their thoughts were on what made for a good app.
And I mean, honestly, again, a lot of this stuff translates. Maybe not 1-to-1 for any kind of development environment, but there's a lot of good practices in here or things to think about at least while you're doing your development. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't care what they say. A lot of these chapters apply to any kind of app development.
Yep.
Yeah, and we hope you like this series. So if you did like it, please leave us a review. And if you didn't, send us an email at comments@codingblocks.net.
Right. That's where the rants go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the resources that we like, obviously, we'll be mentioning the Clearly Tech article again, and the 12factor.net site will obviously be in there.
Yeah, and wanted to mention the Phoenix Project again. It's just basically a book with it's a nice fictional narrative around like a kind of a DevOps transformation that's it's really fun to read, and I don't say that often. Also, I wanted to mention the high scalability blog. We didn't really mention this, but if you want to read some like some really great articles about applications that, for the most part, kind of follow this this methodology, then highscalability.com is a great place to go. They've got fantastic teardowns of like, Pinterest and Netflix, and they talk to the guys in charge of those environments and talk about, their high scalability issues. And there's just a lot of fantastic write-ups there.
All right. So let's get into Alan's favorite section of the show. It's the tip of the week.
The tip of the week. Hey, you know what? I decided something. Like, I just made an executive decision for myself here.
Oh my God.
It's the holiday season. I'm giving 2 tips this time because I couldn't figure out which one I wanted to do. So, if you're ever cloning from a Git repo and you need a specific branch, and it takes, as long as it does for Outlaw to set up his character class in Advanced Warfare, then you don't want to wait around to pull master and then have to switch over to a branch, right? There is a way that you can actually have it just grab that branch. You can do a git clone and then whatever the URL is, then -B for a specific branch that you're looking for, then a space, and then the branch name, and then do another space, 2 dashes, and then single dash branch. And it will pull just that one branch down so that you don't have to clone the repo and then switch over to a new branch. Because there are situations to where, like, if there are major divergent or like the branch has diverged quite a bit from the master branch, it can take forever for it to do those deltas, and especially on a big repo. So I love this one. I used it the other day. It made me smile.
Whoa. How are you going to maintain dev prod parity then if you're dealing with multiple different versions of code bases that you're supporting?
This whole thing that we just did with the 12 factor, that's all fictitional. So
That's right.
No one ever
or
does
fictitious, I should say. So
depending on your, if you are writing a high scalable website like Facebook.com, then this stuff is going to apply. If you have just any other kind of apps, then you can only really use part of these. Like if you've got separate installs on premises of websites, or if you're doing desktop software, then this stuff is just kind of food for thought.
yeah, it definitely that went into the whole multiple versions of things and all that. So the other tip I want to give, and I wanted to point this one out because I've known this one for a while, but the first time that I set up like an Angular app and I did it for a team of people, I didn't really totally understand the npm install stuff. And I figured this might help because I know Node's very popular, and so is npm and, the 5 billion different packages out there. One of the things you can do when you do an npm install is a lot of people they'll show on the directions or in the tutorial npm install -g and then whatever the library is, whether it be gulp, grunt, something like that. Well, what they fail to mention is, okay, if you're setting this up for a team of people that are coming behind you and they're going to need to be able to get their environment set up pretty quick, that does nothing for them. What you need to do when you're setting up your app, if you are doing npm installs and your application needs this library to be able to run the application on your development machine or to be able to run it when it's deployed somewhere, you do an npm install and then --save. That will make it a dependency for your project. So the next person that comes in, they can just, as long as they have Node installed, they can say npm install, and it will go and get all the dependencies, bring them down, and then you can run it. Now, if it's a development dependency, something that you actually need to be able to do your development, and you need to be able to get into the code, then you do an npm install --save-dev. And then that will put it into a different place. So these all go into your packages.json. If you don't put --save or --save-dev, then the next developer that comes, they have to actually know to go out and get all these different packages that you did, as opposed to being able to just say npm install and then everything being done. So if you're setting something up to where a team of people are going to be working on something and you want to make it painless for them, make sure you use the --save or the --save-dev.
You mean you're not going to take the approach that you had to suffer through that pain, and so should they?
I try not to do that.
Oh, okay. You're a nice guy.
Yeah, like I said, I feel kind of giving right now.
Awesome. And I speaking of giving, I'm more of a taker, and so I'm going to steal a tip from one of our listeners. And we've mentioned him before. Jeff Polina, he's awesome, knows a lot about SQL, and he turned me on to SQL Sentry Plan Explorer. And Plan Explorer is free, unlike the rest of SQL Sentry's tools, which cost a small fortune. But it's basically like it lets you do a lot of things. But how I've been using it or starting to use it is basically for execution plans. It's just got a really nice explorer that it like highlights the trouble spots. It lets you see like CPU, and I/O numbers. You can zoom in and out. You can share plans with other people, but just the color coding is really nice because I don't know a lot about execution plan and basically SQL tuning. So it's nice to have something that kind of points me in the right direction a little bit better than your normal kind of SQL Server execution plan.
Hey, in all fairness, I will say though, he said SQL Sentry, like all their tools cost a small fortune. Yep. I don't know of any database tools that don't. Like Redgate's up there, SQL Sentry's up there. Like I don't know any that you basically don't have to mortgage a child for. So, you know.
MySQL, all the things.
Right, there you go.
All right. So, I will, in the spirit of the Star Wars season, also give you 2 tips. And the first one is a WebStorm specific one. So I found myself in a situation where I was going through a manual refactoring effort, where instead of, for whatever reason, I needed to do the name changes myself rather than allowing the tool to do it. I don't remember why, but once I was done, I was like, I really wanted a nice way to verify that I was done, and so initially, I guess the Unix side of me was like, oh yeah, no problem, man. I'll just hop over to my console over here, do a little find action, pipe that over to an Xargs, do a grep on that, and search for all my all instances of this particular string. Only I was on Windows. So
Sigwin.
So yeah, there was totally that option, and being a true Git Bash lover that I am, of course I had Git Bash, which could do similar things. But even in a Sigwin environment, if you, like me, have tried to do these type of situations where you're gonna pipe all the find results out to Xargs and pass that over to grep, then sometimes the spaces in the directories will throw it off Xargs, and it'll start passing off like each different token, space delimited token as a separate argument to whatever you're trying to execute. So it becomes a problem. But what I noticed, which was fantastic, is that in WebStorm, let's say whatever your directory path is, you can right click on the path, okay? And there is a find in path option, right? And you can give it whatever you're trying to search for in that path, and it'll just go and find if there's any instances of it. And if you want to do a replace right then and there, you could also do a replace in path. So you could search an entire directory tree and find or replace within that directory tree within your IDE. So you didn't have to install like a Beyond Compare or whatever
Agent
to do that. Right. You didn't have to do that. You're staying within your IDE. And for the keyboard lovers, Control-Shift-F or Control-Shift-R, and you can do your find or your find and replace from within WebStorm. So I thought that was a pretty cool option.
Yep.
And then as the bonus one, when Alan mentioned Web API earlier, it reminded me of a problem that Web API has. So what I'll describe is, let's say you have 2 controllers, and both controllers have a similar route, right? So in this contrived example, let's say you have a person controller and a company controller, and each one of these things has a name. So you're going to have a method called getName, right? And so what you ultimately want the URL path to look like might be something like API/controller/getName, right? And typically in Web API style development, you would specify the controller in curly braces and let it automatically figure it out for you, right? But this is where it falls to its knees because it's like, well, wait a minute. These both have get name. How do I know which one is for the person controller and which one's for the company controller? Which, for the love of, it's right in the file. It's inside the person controller. Why can't you figure out that I meant this get name belongs to the person controller?
To the person, right? Yeah.
Right. So, because ultimately what you're looking for is a path that would be like /API/person/get name or /company/get name. But unfortunately, it won't figure that out. Web API won't figure that out. And more frustrating than that is it's not a compile time error.
No.
It's not even a runtime error. Well, kind of a runtime error. It'll be a 404 when you try to access it, but you won't get like...
Is it 404 or is it 500?
No, it's a 404.
It gives you a path not found.
Right. It won't find the path at all because they'd be like, I don't know what that is. So it's totally frustrating. So in that case, what you have to do is manually name both. You can't just name one. You have to name both. So you can't use that little curly brace controller trick. Instead, you have to say in your route, you have to manually specify, like if, again, you wanted it in an API path, API/person/get name or API/company/get name. You have to manually type that in rather than saying controller and letting the compiler figure it out.
Now, one thing we do need to point out with this, though, this is if you're using the action approach to Web API as opposed to like the RESTful methods that I guess Web API is kind of intended for. So this is using action routing. So like when he says get name, that would be as if you had an action defined called get name. But yeah, it's
yeah, I didn't mean that like get as in the verb and the name. I meant the name of the path was get name.
Yep.
But okay, so fine. So if you don't like that example, another case where people have run into this before is, let's say you were trying to make a versionable copy of your API. Right? So you release version 1. V1 so it's /API/v1/ whatever your controller is /get name.
Right.
And now you're like, hey, you know what? We've released version 2 and version 2 has some amazing features, but we want to be fully backwards compatible. So if you want to use version 2, you just go to API/v2/person/get name.
Same thing. You got to name them both.
You'd have to name the controller. You'd have to fully name that path in order. And this is a web API.
And it's an attribute, right? If I remember right.
It is an attribute. Yeah. It's an attribute to the method.
Yep.
But this is a web API kind of issue.
Yeah, and it will make you tear your hair out.
Yes.
Yeah, it's aggravating.
Yeah, you'll be like, why? It's right there. I don't understand why why it's not working. Now, if you want to see, okay, so it's not a compile time issue unless you are using Swagger.
Oh, will it pick it up?
If you are using Swagger, which is a way to document all of your web API calls, and it's pretty cool. And there's a counterpart to that, which is Swashbuckle, which will automatically do all that for you. So if you are using Swagger and or Swashbuckle, then what will happen is that will throw a compile time error because it won't know how to, or was it a runtime error? Actually, I may be mistaken.
It would probably be runtime because it wouldn't know how to pick it up, right?
Yeah, it doesn't know how to interpret that. I think that's actually runtime now that I think about it. Yeah. So at any rate, manually name them. That was sadly the answer.
Yep. Not all things in C# and .NET are glorious.
That's definitely one.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, like we said, that was the last chapters of the 12-factor app, chapters 10, 11, and 12. Dev, prod, parity, logs, and admin processes, and we hope you have enjoyed them. You can check out the previous episodes 32, 33, and 35, where we talk about the first 9 chapters of the 12-factor app. Be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app. And be sure to leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you choose to find your podcast. And let us know what that outlet is, because we'd like to know.
Yep, and contact us with any questions or topics. Seriously, we love getting them, and we love answering them. Sometimes we have to do some research, and, everybody benefits.
And it might be a month later.
It may be a little bit while later, but, hey, we do what we can. Leave your name, any preferred method of shout-out you have, whether it's website, Twitter, whatever. We'll mention you in the podcast, and definitely please do leave us a review. Visit us at codingblocks.net, where you can find all our show notes, examples, discussions, and more.
Yep, and send your feedback, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Vine and everywhere else.
Is there anywhere else?
Pinterest, Flickr.
Do we have any Pinterest code?
Nope. Tumblr. We got the name, though.
We need a Slack channel, don't we? We should get a Slack channel.